Guest host is Jim Mars.
And today we have a real special treat. We have author Joseph P. Farrell here to talk about his new book, Babylon's Banksters, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion. And I know if you're like me, you probably went, what? Well, what's alchemy got to do with high finance, and what's high finance got to do with ancient religions? But I'll tell you, folks, Joseph P. Farrell, once again, has raised the bar as far as the knowledge of what's truly going on in the world. And you owe it to yourself to get a copy of Babylon's Banksters, where he ties in the connecting tissue between ancient technology, the use of physics for energy manipulation, through the control mechanism of religion, and on into the more modern control mechanism of fiat money and debt creation, to put the whole ball of wax together that will give you an incredible new perception of what's going on in today's world. Joseph, it's a delight to be with you today, and I have to commend you on I've read all your books, and this has got to be so far the apex of your study.
Well, thanks for having me back, Jim.
What in the world prompted you to tie in ancient technology with modern banking?
Well, it's a book that I've had in mind for some time. It was rather fortuitous that I got around to writing it in the middle of a financial meltdown. But
great timing.
Yeah. But the real thing that did it for me is that, as you know, I've done a series. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold.
I've got allergies, so we'll just hack our way through this.
Yeah, right. But the real thing that did it for me is, as you know, I've done a series of books on ancient history and technology and so on and so forth. And in researching those books, I kept running into two very distinctive clues that I decided that I would set aside and pursue in this book. And the first of these is that there was a definite connection in ancient times between the temple, between the priesthoods and so on, and the issuance of money, number one. And number two, there was a definite connection between those temples and whatever science and technology existed in those high societies like Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley and so on. And I began to look at those two things as kind of a residue of the actions and effects of whatever elites survived my putative cosmic war that I believe took place in this solar system a long time ago. So that essentially is the set of clues that I decided to investigate. And in doing the investigation, I came quickly to the conclusion that what we were looking at is really two different financial systems entirely, and therefore two different perceptions of the nature of physics, the nature of energy, and so on and so forth, and that it has been around not just in the last 100 years with the action of various corporations and banks suppressing technological developments like J.P. Morgan did with Tesla, but that it in fact has been around for millennia. So the basic model of the book is that the banksters, as I like to call them, this international mercantile banking class that's been around also for millennia, has been actively pursuing privately its investigation of what we would call open system physics or free energy physics, whatever you want to call it, while at the same time they're publicly suppressing it. So,
right. So on the one hand, they want the knowledge, but on the other hand, they don't want the public to have the knowledge.
Exactly. Well, you've touched on that very subject yourself in many of your books, and you know, it's fairly clear to see the consistent policy of these people. And what really kind of amazed me is that you can trace the policy all the way back to ancient times. That's the real whopper.
It is, and we're going to go there. But before that, I want to take a slight detour.
Sure.
Because I've got to tell you, and I've got to tell the audience that in your new book, Babylon's Banksters, you have answered one of the great questions I've had about recent history, which is, namely, that as I wrote about in my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, and as you have so adequately detailed in your books, the Nazi International and the Reich of the Black Sun, the Western bankers on Wall Street and in the city of London were the very people who created Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich and funded him and helped build the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, into the political force in pre-war Germany. But then it's also obvious that at some point they turned against him. And then they combined the power of like 26 nations to defeat the Third Reich in World War II, of course, which is, as we all know. My big question was, what caused them to suddenly turn against him? And I, just in general in the past have said, well, obviously he was getting out of control. But
overrunning Europe is a problem.
Why not tell them about how that Hitler started following in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy?
Well, okay, yes. This is one of the things that few people really know, that Hitler and the Nazis had studied and implemented once they took power. There was a German economist by the name of Georg Feder who had studied the system of international finance, and in particular made a very close and careful study of President Lincoln's administration and how he financed the American Civil War, the northern effort in it, by issuing greenbacks. In other words, by issuing state-issued debt-free money on the goods and services and surplus of the state. In other words, basically issuing money against the gross domestic product. Now, let me take a bit of a detour here, Jim, because this is very important for the listeners to understand. Real money is not what we have in this country. Real money is always debt-free and is always issued by the crown or by the state or by the government, whatever you wish to call it, against the goods and services of that particular nation. Therefore, it is always debt-free, all right? What we have now, rather, is monetized debt. In other words, we have notes, all right? These are loaned into circulation by a private bank, in this case the Federal Reserve. And it's very, very important for people to understand that a bank can never issue money. Only governments can do this. Banks only loan money into circulation, and when they do this, they only create the principal. They never create the money to pay the interest. So in other words, there is never within this closed, if you can imagine it like an electrical circuit, there is never enough money in circulation to pay the interest. This is the Ponzi scheme of international banking.
Which means you'll never, ever pay off the principal.
Exactly. The only thing that results is debt always increases, and at some point you reach a stage of meltdown where you have to restructure everything, and the only ones that end up really benefiting from any sort of restructuring are the people owning the debt, namely the bankers.
Sounds like we're kind of at that point right now.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I'm so very, very upset, it would be the mild way to put it, at the recent election results, because no one on either side of the aisle is talking about the one thing that needs to be done to get this country's debt situation taken care of, and that is to return to direct government, federal government issued debt-free money. All right, now let's go back to the Nazis. When the Nazis began to organize as a powerful political force, the thinking of this German economist by the name of Feder became a part of their party ideology. And what Fader had pointed out was the only way that nations can really free themselves from the influence of monetized debt, and therefore from the influence of bankers over their national sovereignty and the policy of their governments, was to return to a system of directly created state-issued money that was debt-free. And again, he used Abraham Lincoln as his model. Now, when Hitler took power, what most people do not know is that he immediately turned his back on the very international bankers that put him into power. Because what the Nazi government did was it created a kind of a parallel currency that was called labor treasury certificates, and these were denominated in Reichsmarks and could circulate as legal tender. And these were created to pay for the labor and the goods and services of Hitler's infrastructure kind of public works New Deal program that basically put Nazi Germany back to work. So in other words, Hitler returned Germany to a system of direct state-issued money and bypassed the bankers completely.
And it was an incredible achievement because when Hitler took power in early 1933, Germany was suffering under hyperinflation. We all remember the stories of the wheelbarrow loads of money to buy a loaf of bread. And half the population almost was out of work. And just within 2 years, by 1935, because he issued debt-free money, Germany had become a powerhouse.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Germany's economy under the early years of the Nazi regime was absolutely booming. We have to remember that at that point in history, Germany had the second largest gross domestic product in the world. So in other words, it was second behind the United States in terms of its economic power.
And wasn't it his public works programs that put everybody back to work and everybody was making money, and then they went out and spent money, and the whole economy just began to blossom?
The whole economy literally turned around almost overnight. And this is a story that repeats itself in history, and it's very important. And I get into this a bit in Babylon's Banksters, because
I suspect, Joseph, that we're going to see a repeat of this come 2012. People in this country are going to be so fed up, they're going to vote for whoever the media tells us is our savior, and they'll start restructuring the whole thing.
It may be the case that will come about, but this is why I think it's very important for people to understand. Number one, you must understand that the Federal Reserve cannot issue money. It can only loan money, and when it loans money, it is not creating enough money in circulation to pay off the interest. The only way to restore things is to get back to state-issued money. And I was about to mention the case of the 13 colonies prior to the American Revolution.
A great example.
What most people do not realize, Jim, and has been carefully expunged from American history textbooks in this country, is that each of the 13 colonies prior to the Revolution was issuing its own state-created or colony-created paper money based against or backed by the goods and services of each colony. And during that period, because we had this debt-free money in circulation, we were not dependent upon the bullion, in other words, of the Bank of England, the colonies and their economies were prospering to such an extent we had virtually full employment. And what happened? Well, of course, that meant that they were bypassing the banksters of the private bankers of the Bank of England completely. And so the Bank of England, of course, put pressure on Parliament in London to pass the various laws that basically meant, the Stamp Act and so on and so forth. And as part of these laws, they also prohibited the colonies from issuing this currency. And that was one of the direct causes of the American Revolutionary War, because the result of that was the colonies' economies collapsed. There began to be rampant unemployment in the colonies, and so on and so forth, all because of this very simple change in fiscal policy.
That's true. And folks, just in case to verify what Joseph just said, let me quote you from Benjamin Franklin, who wrote, quote, the colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction, end quote.
Yep. Exactly.
That's exactly right. And I've got to point out here that in June of 1963, President John F. Kennedy took steps to issue interest-free money through the Treasury Department in the form of United States notes.
Yep.
So Kennedy and Lincoln were the two U.S. presidents who made the attempts to issue interest-free money, and I don't think it was just a coincidence, Joseph, that both of those men were shot in the head in public.
Oh, heavens, no. You point out Kennedy's executive order. I think it was 11,110 in your book Crossfire.
Mm-hmm.
And if I recall correctly, Jim, in Crossfire, you mentioned that Kennedy, in that executive order, which was signed in June of 1963, right, and that this order was to circulate $4 billion and a few $100-odd million worth of United States notes into circulation. Well, I remember spending some of those United States notes as a child, and this was debt-free money. And it's interesting to me also the way that Kennedy did this. He and his Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon were very clearly a concern to the Federal Reserve and the bankers behind it, even as Kennedy was running for president. There were articles in the Wall Street Journal and so on and so forth that expressed concern about what Kennedy's real intentions with the Federal Reserve were, because they were afraid that he was going to somehow to go after their power. Well, what Kennedy did was, in my opinion, very, very clever, in that he didn't come right out and attack the Federal Reserve directly. All he and his Treasury Secretary did was, number one, issue this executive order for the circulation of these United States notes, and then two, they made certain concessions to banks that were not members of the Federal Reserve System to engage in certain lending policies that had previously been a private fiefdom or preserve of the Federal Reserve. So, in other words, he didn't attack it directly, and I think you're right. I think in this next election we're going to hear more talk about the Federal Reserve and things that we can do to bypass the power of it without directly going after it. I mean, my word, we've already heard from both sides of the aisle in Congress in the last election cycle, two election cycles. We've already heard calls for auditing the Federal Reserve, things of this sort, and I think that's only going to increase.
I agree, and I think an audit of the Fed is just a very simple first step
in
finding out what's going on. I mean, over the past couple of years, we have seen trillions of U.S. dollars shipped overseas as credit swaps by the Fed, going to foreign banks to support them, prop them up, keep them in business. And then when Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and asked to say, well, which banks got this, and what are they doing with it, and what kind of collateral did they put up? He tells Congress, well, we're a private concern. That's proprietary information. I'm not going to tell you that.
Exactly.
It's absolutely incredible. They're bleeding this country of its financial resources, and then won't even tell us what's happening to the money.
Exactly. This is not a situation that any nation state that values its national sovereignty can afford to be in. And it's interesting to me, Jim, if you study China right now, their money is state-created, debt-free money. And this is one reason, it's the overlooked reason why China's economy is booming, because there's no debt interest on the money that's in circulation.
It's really pretty simple, and yet nobody understands this, and I guess they won't, because it's been, as you said, it's been expunged out of our educational system, and also the very same people who control the banks, that control the feds, control the 5 multinational corporations that control everything we see and hear.
Yes,
not just
exactly.
news, but movies, films, TV, broadcast, satellites, movies, TV, books,
yes.
billboards, magazines, and so they are very careful to keep this very simple understanding of finances from the people.
Yes. Well, again, this is, as you pointed out, not only something that they're trying to keep from the people, but in the case of Nazi Germany, by the time that Hitler implements this fiscal policy and the Third Reich has overrun most of Europe, which, was as early as May of 1941, the handwriting is on the wall, at least as far as Anglo-American bankers are concerned, because if this system survived, it would spread. I mean, my word, the financial system that Hitler put into place literally made possible German military power in World War II. It literally made a country the size of the state of Texas, where you live, it made this tiny, bothersome country an economic and military powerhouse. So, from the banker's point of view, it had to be put down. This to me is the hidden logic behind the calls for unconditional surrender. It was not only because we needed to get rid of a notoriously criminal and brutal regime, but the hidden reason is if that regime had somehow managed to survive, their system would have spread.
Exactly, and this was pretty well clarified by Winston Churchill, who said, and I quote, "You must understand that this war is not against Hitler or National Socialism, but against the strength of the German people, which must be smashed once and for all, regardless
yes.
of whether it's in the hands of Hitler or a Jesuit priest." And
yes.
when he talks about the strength of the German people, he was talking about the economic strength of the
yes.
German people. Correct?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And again, the response, to me, it's very interesting that the response of the Nazi leadership as the war began to go against them was largely stated by Martin Bormann, who said that, Nazism was going to survive the war, he would see to that, and number two, that one of the post-war goals of the Nazis would be to create a European confederation, which, in his words, Germany would be able to dominate through elastic political means. All right? And my word, Jim, look at Germany now, right now.
Exactly.
Right now, Germany has some of the lowest unemployment in the world. This is almost a complete turnaround from the situation they were in right after the reunification.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, we are looking at things unfold, and I think to a certain extent we're looking at behind-the-scenes factional infighting between this Anglo-American elite, which is in a heap a lot of trouble,
right, and
the continental European elite, which I think has a large contingent of whatever you want to call it, international
unreconstructed fascists. Nazis, how's that?
Unreconstructed Nazis is probably the best way to put it. But, I try and point out in Babylon's Banksters what I consider to be, and it's interesting that we're doing this interview because I've always wanted to ask you this question. But I point out...
Hold your thought,
sure.
hold that question, and I will do my poorest poor part to try to answer it right after this break.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland Online with guest host Jim Mars.
Howdy, this is Jim Mars, back again here on Dreamland, and today we're having a very fascinating conversation with Joseph P. Farrell, the author of Babylon's Banksters. And just before the break, Joseph said he had a question he had always wanted to ask me. And so, Joseph, as we say in the assassination research community, shoot.
Okay. Well, I want to preface the question by mentioning an observation that I made at the beginning of Babylon's Banksters. And that is, in my opinion, the real purpose behind the initial founding and meetings of the Bilderberg Group was precisely to coordinate activities between this Anglo-American corporate banking elite in London and New York with the surviving Nazi elite in Europe, as represented by Prince Bernhard, who was one of the founders of the Bilderberg Group, for the express purpose of taking all of that Nazi loot and moving it into the Western banks, essentially to launder it, and to, in turn, allow these banks a liquid reserve against which they could expand their own ledger credit-making ability in the West and begin the process of creating the post-war economic boom in the West. So I've always wondered if that reading or that scenario was something that you had ever entertained in your research.
Yes, it is, exactly. In fact, I should point out that Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, along with a fellow named Joseph Ratzinger, were the founders of what is now known as the Bilderberg Group. And Prince Bernhard, as the head of Shell, the Dutch oil company, yes, had been a Nazi SS officer.
Yes, yes.
And before he fled and went to England and then proclaimed his allegiances to the Allies, which I personally think was just a smokescreen to perpetuate Martin Bormann's plans for the survival of National Socialism.
Here.
But Joseph, this is really fascinating to me because I always thought the name Bilderbergers came strictly from the fact that they were first quickly identified when they were found meeting in 1954, I believe it was, at the Bilderberg Hotel,
yes,
in Holland. But you have in Babylon's Banksters the fact that Prince Bernhard, when he was a member of the SS, had also been a officer in the IG Farben Combine, and that there was a department or a section known as the Farben Builder.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, that piece of information actually comes from the researcher into the Bilderberg Group, Daniel Estulin, all right, and he mentions it in his book, The Bilderberg Group. And I thought it was so fascinating that I had to include it, because what the Farben Builder was it was a group of executives within the IG Farben Combine that banded together essentially to create a kind of interface between IG Farben and the Nazi Party with the express purpose of funding Farben's secret research, of funding some of the secret research that the Nazis wanted to do. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is long before Martin Bormann's strategic evacuation plan and the Hotel Maison Rouge meeting in Strasbourg, France in August of 1944. Long before this, you have Farben setting up various bureaus and offices within the corporation to interface directly with the Nazi Party in order to further the goals of the Nazi Party. There's this corporate party interface that in turn I think Martin Bormann takes over as his model for his strategic evacuation plan. Because what does Bormann say in that meeting at the Hotel Maison Rouge? He says that the party will create liaison officers to oversee and liaise between the Nazi Party after the war and each major German corporation, Krupp, Thyssen, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the Farben model becomes the way that the post-war Nazi International is able to survive, number one, and number two, oversee and direct the corporate research efforts of German corporations after the war. So all of this, as far as I'm concerned, Jim, becomes part of the model behind the Bilderberg Group, because what in effect it means is that Prince Bernhard and some of the other Nazis in attendance at those early Bilderberg meetings, like Dr. Hermann Josef Abs, who's the CEO of Deutsche Bank, what it means is that the Bilderberg Group itself is a huge example of this Farben model of interfacing between the party and major corporations. That's exactly what I think is going on.
Well, I think I agree with you. And furthermore, this, of course, allowed these ranking Nazis, and particularly the financial end of it, to maintain their control over corporate economics even after the war.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it accounts for another strange thing, even though I don't mention this in Babylon's Banksters. I think it's worth mentioning here in this context. And that is, if you go back to the efforts of West German federal and state prosecutors, Länder prosecutors, to find Martin Bormann in the late 60s and early 70s and then bring him to prosecution inside of West Germany, many of these prosecutors went on record in Germany saying that while they had bent every effort to track down and pursue the case, they always came up against this invisible brick wall. In other words, that Bormann and his reputation, and remember, Bormann is supposed to be dead.
Okay. Right. Oh, he died then. He died during the fight for Berlin, according to the official word.
Yeah, exactly. And, even there, the official story is there's about 3 different versions of it.
Yeah, right. You can take your pick. Take your pick. And what I love is that I think this might have been in the early 70s when the mainstream publications were thick with stories about how Martin Bormann survived, and he was hiding out in South America, and he was still running this Nazi clandestine operation. All of a sudden, they turned up with a skull in Berlin that they said they had dug up, and that they said, this proves it's Martin Bormann, and therefore, we're going to quit looking for him, and that's the end of that story, folks. And everything went quiet. And the problem is that in examinations of this skull showed traces of this red clay that was not available anywhere in Germany, but was available in the area of South America, Argentina, where he had been reported living. So there's a lot of question about that. But Joseph, this is fascinating, but we're running out of time, and I want to get to the real meat of your book, which is, and keep in mind you're among friends here on Dreamland, so you can actually use the term extraterrestrial. Okay. So what you're telling us, and outline this if you would, is that this knowledge of fiat money, debt-issued money, economics based on control and debt, this can be traced all the way back to ancient Sumer, which even the Encyclopedia Britannica tells us laid down some of the fundamentals of writing, mathematics, nature studies, astronomy, just basically laid the foundation for every Western civilization that has been can be tracked right back to ancient Sumer. Do you believe that this knowledge came from the Anunnaki extraterrestrials?
Well, there is a clear, in my opinion, there is a clear case, and I think a very strong prima facie case that can be made that much of this knowledge, number one, comes from off-world, from our genetic cousins, if you want to look at them that way, which is what I think these Anunnaki were. In other words, I think they were of the genus Homo sapiens, and that this made the genetic engineering of modern humanity possible because there was a close enough resemblance to begin with, all right? In other words, to put it somewhat differently, they look like us, walk like us, and talk like us, all right?
Right. But let me quickly point out here to for those who are familiar with the late Zacharias Sitchin and many others who have been writing about this, and you hear the criticism and the claim that, well, are you trying to say that we were created by aliens? And no, Joseph, I think you'll agree with me, because if you actually study the Sumerian tablets, well, it makes it very clear that what they did was the same thing that we do today to animals, horses, cows, and sheep. They improved the breed by manipulating the DNA.
Yes, this is very clear. Although in fact, I should mention I have a book coming out next spring called Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, in which I discuss the particular tablets where this story is told rather closely. The tablets are known as the Karsag tablets, all right?
Mm-hmm.
But the story that you read in those tablets is that there was a definite injection of what we would call alien DNA, or what I would prefer, simply because of the connotations of the word alien and the highly charged atmosphere of ufology. I prefer simply to use the term genetic cousins. There was some sort of intermingling of DNA from that group and whatever hominid or proto-human species existed on Earth at the time. And what I also attempt to do is compare the Karsag tablets with some of the findings of modern genetic research, Brian Sykes and people like that at Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an amazing, what pops out of it is an amazing parallel. But to get back to your original question, yes, there's no question in my mind, Jim, that what we are looking at with the rise of civilizations such as Sumeria is the influence of a surviving elite that survived this big cosmic war and immediately took steps, long-term steps, to recreate the infrastructures necessary towards civilization. And in Sumer's case, it's very important that we mention what their financial policy was. Because in Sumer's case, money was quite literally in the form of little clay tablets, all right? That was their version of our paper money. It was not bullion-based. It was not anything other than money circulated as a receipt on the surplus goods in the state warehouse. In other words, it was debt-free money. It was debt-free money. And it was understood that it was the issuance and prerogative of the state, all right? So in other words, this idea of state-issued money, debt-free money, is very, very old, and it's the bedrock of stable civilization. And we have to add into this commentary, Jim, another important point, and this I hope people will really listen to, because one of the most stable ancient civilizations was precisely ancient Egypt. And it's very, very important and critical to understand that for over 1,000 years, ancient Egypt managed to keep its national finances out of the hands of what was then becoming an international banker class. I call them bullion brokers because that's essentially what they were. The ancient Egyptians managed to keep their state-issued money out of private hands for a very long time. And in my opinion, that contributed to the stability and longevity of that society.
Right. Incredible. Now, so when do you suppose they decided to, well, how about this? Correct me if you think I'm wrong. Early on, the control mechanism over the population was religion.
Yes.
Okay? We're your gods, or we're direct mouthpiece from God, and God says you got to do this, you have to work at this, etc. But as the religion began to lose its chokehold on the world's populations, as they became more educated and more sophisticated, then, in my mind, they turned to debt-issued money as a control mechanism.
Well, I would agree. Definitely agree with that, because one of the things I attempt to show in Babylon's Banksters is that you have a very interesting thing begins to happen as these international bullion brokers increase in their power, and that is they do two things, Jim, that have survived all these millennia as standard tactics of the banksters whenever a nation-state decides it's going to attempt to issue directly state-issued money that's debt-free. And that is, number one, they resort to massive counterfeiting, all right? In other words, they simply counterfeit that currency, whatever it may be, if it's cuneiform clay tablets or Lincoln Green
or whatever.
Yeah, or Lincoln Greenbacks, whatever. They simply resort to massive counterfeiting efforts in an effort to crash the currency. And then they do something else. They take out of circulation any legitimately state-issued money. In other words, they take out of circulation the one form of currency and then substitute their own. And by these combined efforts, what they're really doing is saying, see, our stuff is much more stable than your stuff. Now, Jim, this has happened over and over again in history.
Right.
In the American Revolution, the Bank of England had literally created and set up a bunch of counterfeiters in the American colonies that were counterfeiting colonial scrip to crash the colonial currency on the one hand, and on the other, they were trying to remove as much of it as possible from the legitimate stuff from circulation and substitute their own Bank of England pound notes, all right? And again, we see the same thing happen after President Kennedy issues that executive order, and a few of those debt-free United States notes get into circulation. Well, what does the Federal Reserve do whenever they get any of those in their banks? They simply remove them from circulation.
That's right. And by the way, to the best of my research, that executive order of Kennedy's has never been rescinded. It has just been ignored.
Exactly. Just ignored. So, we're looking at tactics that haven't changed, Jim, over the millennia. And if we go back then to ancient times, what happens is, since the state had the sovereign authority to issue debt-free money, what often happened as a result was that the temple became more or less the de facto state bank, because the temple added the probity or the sanction, if you will, of the gods or of religion to the issuance.
God ordained us to be in charge of the money.
Right. But now what happens as the banksters get into the act and you begin to see the emergence of an international trading class, they insinuate themselves or infiltrate themselves into the temple, and it's therefore from the temple that you see this effort to restructure the state-issued money into private monopoly hands. So the nature of the temple itself, the nature of religion changes as a result of this. It becomes a private preserve. It becomes a private monopoly, not only over, quote-unquote, whatever truths of religion that a particular society may believe, but also it begins to show all the signs of the modern-day Federal Reserve or Bank of England, because the temple then becomes the monopoly bank, issuing not state-issued money anymore, but money loaned into circulation bearing interest.
That's right. And so historically, if you opposed their system, then you became heretics.
Exactly.
And like the Cathars, you would be wiped out by a papal army, right? And
exactly.
And here in modern America, see, you don't get a tax break unless you are a religion that is recognized by the government.
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
Boy. Okay, so now what we have now is ancient ET knowledge that of technology and of finance and of religion as opposed to spiritualism, and that have blended together and brought us up to this point in time. And what you suggest in your book is that these banksters who can trace their lineage, I found it very fascinating that one of the Rothschild family members was actually named Nimrod, who was the god king of Mesopotamia. But in an effort, they want to try to gain control over the entire Earth, over the entire planet, to gain not only the mineral and resources, but to gain the technology. And tell us what you think their goal is. Why are they trying to do this?
Oh boy, an excellent question. To answer that, let me begin by saying that people have to understand that even though Babylon's Banksters as a book is intended to stand on its own, I also write my books in kind of a pre-planned order. In other words, it was intentionally conceived to be part of a much larger series of books that preceded it, all right? And therefore, I situate Babylon's Banksters in the context of another book I wrote called The Cosmic War, and Whitley and you have interviewed me on that book here on Dreamland.
Right. Which basically, folks, if you haven't read those, and I suggest you do, builds the case for an extremely prehistorical civilization on the Earth that was part of a solar system-wide civilization that somehow fell into rebellion or into war, and that the planets were bombarded, creating a lot of just havoc, and so going from there. So on the Earth, everything fell back almost into a very primitive state of existence, in which we are only just now pulling ourselves out of.
Right. Well, this is the context in which I wrote Babylon's Banksters quite intentionally, and this is the reason that at the very beginning of Babylon's Banksters, I talk about the end of World War II, the Bilderberg meetings, and the surviving elites from both sides of the war. Because if you use that as kind of a model and go back to this presumed solar system-wide war and the collapse of a civilization that was interplanetary, what you're going to have, Jim, are essentially two surviving elites. You're going to have an elite of the so-called victors that survives, and you're going to have an elite of the so-called vanquished that survived. And their first priority is going to be to preserve as much of their knowledge as possible and to rebuild. And as part of that goal, then, one or the other side is going to have as a goal to rebuild the global basis of the civilization that they once were in possession of, all right? And again, I'm not saying that I complete the story in Babylon's Banksters, but I'm beginning that post-war story. Because one of the very first things, one of the essential things that's necessary for civilization is trade and commerce. And therefore you have to have the means of social cohesiveness, which religion is the easiest thing to provide that. And then secondly, you have to have the means and methods of exchange. In other words, you have to have some system of money. So in other words, what I'm saying in Babylon's Banksters is you've got the financial policies of two very different elites at work. You've got the policy of the elite that wants everything to be kind of an open systems physics and an open systems finance, and they're the ones putting into place these societies with their debt-free money. Then on the other hand, you've got the so-called bad guys, the bad elite, that wants to monopolize whatever technology that they're able to reconstruct for themselves and basically turn everybody else into slaves. And they're the ones pursuing the policy of the monopoly loaning of monetized debt into circulation. So in other words, I think you're looking at the action of two elites. What's their goal? I think, first of all, both have a goal to reach or re-achieve a state where civilization is once again truly global. And this is the reason I think that we're seeing so much now as we're entering the phase of civilization. We're making the transition between a Type 0 civilization and a Type 1 civilization, in that we're witnessing the continuing demise and increasing irrelevance of the nation state in a global corporate system. All right? And I think this is the reason that you're seeing at the same time emerge such an interest in ancient history, in ancient mysteries, and in my opinion, even the planning of actual military operations to recover some of this ancient lost technology.
Such as the looting of the Iraqi National Museum and the
Bingo! You've read my mind.
Right? Of course. All right. So they want to gain control of the world, so then they can reestablish the ancient technology.
Right.
But, okay, is that because they want to make a nice world here, or is it because they want to get the technology so they can return to their home world?
I think it's a little bit of both, because again, I think what you have to remember is you're looking at the action of two elites, and I'm assuming in my answer, Jim, that these elites have survived since the end of that cosmic war in a more or less continuous and uninterrupted form. Now, that's quite a whopper of a statement to say.
Until you understand that through the leadership, ruling families throughout recorded history, they've all been concerned with the bloodline.
Well, yes, exactly.
So could it be that whoever's closest to the ancient Anunnaki bloodline sees themselves as the legitimate rulers of the world?
Well, there are other reasons than that, but that's one of them. And again, I pursue some of that aspect of the story in the new book I've got coming out called Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. Because again,
unfortunately, we're out of time. But I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I certainly look forward to your new book next year. And so, unfortunately, the clock has run out, and this is Jim Mars.
In those temples, and whatever science and technology existed in those high societies like Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley and so on. And I began to look at those two things as kind of a residue of the actions and effects of whatever elites survived my putative cosmic war that I believe took place in this solar system a long time ago. So that essentially is the set of clues that I decided to investigate. And in doing the investigation, I came quickly to the conclusion that what we were looking at is really two different financial systems entirely, and therefore two different perceptions of the nature of physics, the nature of energy, and so on and so forth, and that it has been around not just in the last 100 years with the action of various corporations and banks suppressing technological developments like J.P. Morgan did with Tesla, but that it, in fact, has been around for millennia. So the basic model of the book is that the banksters, as I like to call them, this international mercantile banking class that's been around also for millennia, has been actively pursuing privately its investigation of what we would call open system physics or free energy physics, whatever you want to call it, while at the same time they're publicly suppressing it. So,
right. So on the one hand, they want the knowledge, but on the other hand, they don't want the public to have the knowledge.
Exactly. Well, you've touched on that very subject yourself in many of your books, and you know, it's fairly clear to see the consistent policy of these people. And what really kind of amazed me is that you can trace the policy all the way back to ancient times. That's the real whopper.
It is, and we're going to go there. But before that, I want to take a slight detour.
Sure.
Because I've got to tell you, and I've got to tell the audience that in your new book, Babylon's Banksters, you have answered one of the great questions I've had about recent history, which is, namely, that as I wrote about in my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, and as you have so adequately detailed in your books, the Nazi International and the Reich of the Black Sun, the Western bankers on Wall Street and in the city of London were the very people who created Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich and funded him and helped build the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, into the
Guest host is Jim Mars.
And today we have a real special treat. We have author Joseph P. Farrell here to talk about his new book, Babylon's Banksters, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion. And I know if you're like me, you probably went, what? What's alchemy got to do with high finance, and what's high finance got to do with ancient religions? But I'll tell you, folks, Joseph P. Farrell, once again, has raised the bar as far as the knowledge of what's truly going on in the world. And you owe it to yourself to get a copy of Babylon's Banksters, where he ties in the connecting tissue between ancient technology, the use of physics for energy manipulation, through the control mechanism of religion, and on into the more modern control mechanism of fiat money and debt creation, to put the whole ball of wax together that will give you an incredible new perception of what's going on in today's world. Joseph, it's a delight to be with you today, and political force in pre-war Germany, but then it's also obvious that at some point they turned against him. And then they combined the power of like 26 nations to defeat the Third Reich in World War II, of course, which is,
right,
as we all know. My big question was, what caused them to suddenly turn against him? And I, just in general in the past have said, well, obviously he was getting out of control. But
yeah, overrunning Europe
really
is a problem.
Why don't tell them about how that Hitler started following in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy.
Well, okay, yes. This is one of the things that few people really know, that Hitler and the Nazis had studied and implemented once they took power. There was a German economist by the name of Georg Feder who had studied the system of international finance, and in particular made a very close and careful study of President Lincoln's administration and how he financed the American Civil War, the Northern effort in it, by issuing greenbacks. In other words, by issuing state-issued debt-free money on the goods and services and surplus of the state. In other words, basically issuing money against the gross domestic product. Now, let me
I have to commend you on I've read all your books, and this has got to be so far the apex of your study.
Well, thanks for having me back, Jim.
What in the world prompted you to tie in ancient technology with modern banking?
Well, it's a book that I've had in mind for some time. It was rather fortuitous that I got around to writing it in the middle of a financial meltdown. But
great timing.
Yeah. But the real thing that did it for me is that, as you know, I've done a series. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold.
I've got allergies, so we'll just hack our way through this.
Yeah, right. But the real thing that did it for me is, as you know, I've done a series of books on ancient history and technology and so on and so forth. And in researching those books, I kept running into two very distinctive clues that I decided that I would set aside and pursue in this book. And the first of these is that there was a definite connection in ancient times between the temple, between the priesthoods and so on, and the issuance of money, number one. And number two, there was a definite connection between